Hey guys, this is Mark, and I wanted to specifically talk to the guys on the autism spectrum in this video. In the men's group, the therapy group that we do, we get into some of the traits of the disorder that get in the way of relationships, and we talk about mind blindness, alexithymia, some executive functions deficits, and of course anxiety. But I wanted to narrow it down in this video because I find that guys on the autism spectrum, people in general, wouldn't necessarily have to be men, do tend to have some thinking errors because of the mind blindness stuff. So I just wanted to take a couple minutes and go into some greater detail with that, because I keep getting a lot of questions about thinking errors. So on that note, I'm going to talk about some of these. Let's talk briefly about all or nothing thinking. And so this would be where you think in absolute terms, pretty much black and white thinking, okay? And you'll know if you're engaging in this all or nothing thinking if you use terms like always, every, never, like you always do this, or every time this happens, blah, 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 or I never, blah, 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 and so on. For instance, let's say you get, you get a bad report from your boss. You know, he was disappointed in something that you did, and so you view yourself as a total failure, okay? You did 110 things right, and the one thing you did wrong, you're going to consider that, well, because I did make a mistake at work and got reprimanded by my boss there. That would be an example of all or nothing thinking. Catastrophizing. Now, this would be where you focus on the worst possible outcome, even though that outcome may be like very, very unlikely. Or you think about a situation, another version of catastrophizing would be thinking that a situation is unbearable or impossible when really it's just uncomfortable. So you're kind of exaggerating the difficulty. Does that make sense? And now let's look at the business of disqualifying the positive. So here you continually shoot down positive experiences for very arbitrary and impromptu reasons. So in this way, you can maintain a negative belief that is contradicted by your everyday experiences. So, for example, the fact that I am an excellent artist doesn't count because everything else about my life sucks. So that would be an example of disqualifying the positive. Let's look at emotional reasoning now. This would be when the individual makes decisions and arguments even based on how he feels rather than on objective reality. So what you're doing here with emotional reasoning is you're saying, because I feel this way, therefore it is a fact. Now let's look at fortune telling. This is anticipating things, just expecting that things will turn out badly. And this is where the person feels convinced that his prediction is already an established fact. So, for example, because I think that I will fail to make, let's say that there is a particular advancement at work that you are wanting. And it's a step up the ladder and it's a little more pay. But you say, for example, because I think that I will fail at getting to that next rung on the corporate ladder, I most certainly will fail. Right? Because I think I will fail, therefore I will fail. So I'm basically assuming that my thoughts, in this case, can predict the future. Okay, let's go to jumping to conclusions. Now, this is assuming something negative where there is actually no evidence to support it. let's say, for example, and again, I'm kind of talking to the guys on the autism spectrum here, and it seems I'm using the examples of kind of work-related stuff, really. So let's say, for example, your coworkers, maybe they're not as friendly to you as you would like, and so you make the sweeping generalization that none of your peers, none of your coworkers like you. But you really don't really have any evidence that that is the case. So again, with jumping to conclusions, you're assuming something negative when really there's really no actual evidence to support that. And you might even talk to one of your coworkers and say to him, I don't feel like anybody here likes me. And this one coworker that you're confiding in goes, no, everybody here likes you. I've never heard anybody say one bad thing about you. So let's move on to labeling now. Now this involves explaining by naming. So rather than describing the specific behavior, the individual assigns a label to someone or himself that puts the other person or himself in absolute and unalterable negative terms. I'm going to make up another example. A good statement that would coincide with labeling would be if you say something along the lines of, my coworker won't talk to me, therefore he is a jerk, or therefore he is a narcissist. So you're basically labeling people based on your perception of their behavior. I hope that makes sense. Let's move on now to magnification. Now this basically involves exaggerating the negatives. So you may have had 10 things go right for you today. One thing goes wrong at the end of the day, and so you view the entire day as a disaster. So this involves exaggerating the negatives, and really what coincides with that is ignoring the positives. So mental filter, this is the next one. This is focusing exclusively on certain aspects of something while ignoring the rest. For instance, let's say the individual selectively hears the one tiny negative thing surrounded by all the big positive things. I'll use the example of, let's say your boss makes 9 positive comments about your project and one little slight constructive criticism there at the very end, but you obsess about that one little short piece of constructive criticism that he threw in at the very end of a long list of really praising you for good work. Mind reading. This involves assuming the intentions of others. You just presume that you know what they're up to. For example, the individual may arbitrarily conclude that his peer is thinking negatively of him, but even though you're thinking that, you don't bother to check it out and actually ask. So let's see, we've got mind reading. I'm sorry, we just did that one. Minimization. This involves understating the positives. Enough said about that. Overgeneralization. So this is taking isolated cases and using them to make sweeping generalizations. For example, let's say the individual views a single negative event as a never-ending pattern of defeat. Okay? He views a single negative event as a never-ending pattern of defeat. For example, my wife just yelled at me. She's always yelling at me, therefore she must not like me. So there's a perfect example of overgeneralization. Let's go on to personalization now. Now this occurs when the person holds himself personally responsible for an event that really isn't entirely under his control. Okay? I'm going to make up a ridiculous example. Let's say, say your parents got divorced when you were a teenager. And so you say, my parents got divorced, it must be because I was a bad son. Or my NT wife seems to be upset, therefore it must have something to do with me. And so you're just assuming that you're the one, that you're the cause of somebody else's behavior. And the last one we're going to look at is shoulding. And this is when the person focuses on what he cannot control. For example, he concentrates on what he thinks should or ought to be, rather than the actual situation he is faced with. And if you use the term should a lot, oh, I should have done that, or I shouldn't have done this. Or you can use shoulding with other people. You shouldn't do that, or you should do that, or you must do this. That's an example of shoulding. So there we have the 14 thinking errors that tie into, at some level, the mind blindness issue. And so I basically just wanted to go into further detail in that. Often I don't have time to do that in group. I wanted to do that in this video. Speaking of men's group, feel free to email me. If you want to register for the next men's group coming up. And be glad to have you. This is a men's only group. You don't necessarily have to be on the autism spectrum to join that group. It usually has several men in there where they suspect that they do, but they haven't necessarily had a formal diagnosis. So, okay. So I think that'll be it for now, guys. Feel free to ask any questions underneath the video, and I'll try to find time to answer those at some point. Thanks.